government are pretty powerful and they're moving quickly, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that we're an organization that believes in the power of ideas and applies the power of ideas in trying to preserve freedom in our state and country. You may know of us for our free market economics or our research and commentary on education, economic growth, and the workplace, but we also actively agitate for constitutional and accountable government for Ohioans. Now, we work in Ohio, but we also have friends and a peer organization in Kentucky. It's the Bluegrass Institute. Some of you from across the river may be familiar with them. There's many here. I'm going to, if I could, just introduce two of them. Chris Derry, a friend of mine who is on the board from the Bluegrass Institute, and also Kelly Smith, who is on the staff of Bluegrass Institute. There's several other board members, Matt and Ed and others, so feel free to talk to them about their organization down in Kentucky and what it does for the same values as we do here in Ohio. We're discussing today our new book, No Crime But Prejudice, Fischer Holmes, The Immigration Fiasco and Extrajudicial Prosecution. It's written by John Entine, who will meet shortly. To get some of the questions out first, if I may, with the privilege of the moderator, for us to think about with this particular story, which some of you may be familiar with. There will be an opportunity to buy the book afterwards. I highly recommend it. I'd like to just ask us to think about what we could be looking at in terms of why and how people like Henry Fisher find themselves in the government's crosshairs. We have to think about how it must be a particularly hellish U.S. attorneys secure guilty pleas or verdicts in 85% of their cases. The Court of Appeals at the federal level rules for government in whole or part in 92% of the cases. These are, again, very long odds if you're an innocent man. A person under the cloud of criminal prosecution experiences the blunt force of government's enormous credibility and resources. How often do you catch yourself thinking, and even I do from time to time, the government wouldn't be charging them if they hadn't done something wrong? Now, the government singling out Mr. Fisher for the purpose of sending a warning signal to businesses nationwide should be of concern to all. Where is the justice when the weight of the federal government falls on one company and one executive simply to intimidate thousands of others to better comply with difficult laws? That's one question I hope we can hear more about today. There are economic consequences for this practice. We work on free market economics. We are working with a state to help a state that has lost 500,000 jobs, 500,000 jobs, since peak employment of March 2000. We have heard about Japan and their lost decade. Well, we're living in a lost decade here in Ohio, and people like Mr. Fisher were the source of our prosperity in the past, and they're going to be the source of our prosperity in the future, but it's not going to happen if they get treated the way that Mr. Fisher seems to have been treated by the federal prosecutorial system. So there's grave economic consequences for this practice. If you think of the familiar waste of physicians practicing defensive medicine, just think of the tremendous cost of defensive, legal, and regulatory compliance by business. The issue of immigration and the application of federal laws and other issues are going to be an important part of the book and the discussion today. Still, I hope we can remember that our discussion is not whether this is a badly handled case, but whether it was a bad case to begin with. And perhaps to ask where were the checks and balances that we're familiar with in the criminal justice system, and especially when the tactics of extrajudicial prosecution are at play, where were those checks and balances that ought to have weeded out this bad case before it caused so much harm for so little good? We do a lot of policy education here at the Buckeye Institute, and so does the Bluegrass Institute, and we Americans have to remain ever vigilant for our freedoms. I'm from Minnesota originally, and I was up on a fishing trip over in Thunder Bay, and I heard a National Guards person from the Canadian National Guard talking about he was on a joint exercise with Americans, and they were out in Thunder Bay, and I heard a National Guards person from the Canadian National Guard talking about he was on a joint exercise with Americans, and they were out somewhere, and he was the sentry, and an American came up and said, "I'd like to get back on the post," and the Canadian said, "Please identify yourself," and the American said, "I'm an American," and the Canadian said, "If you're an American, tell me the 10 articles of your Bill of Rights." And the American said, "I don't know." And the Canadian said, "If you're an American, come on in." We take it for granted what we have here in America. And the founders knew that we have a Constitution that protects us, protects people like Mr. Fisher, but they knew that only citizens' eternal vigilance would in the end preserve freedom from the power of government gone wrong. So by telling his story, I believe that Henry Fisher is accepting a special responsibility of those who have experienced firsthand government's abuse of the power we give it. We heard this morning in our panel, and I'm learning it as well with everybody on this process, and that is that Mr. Fischer's story, at least to the part of when the charges were finally dropped, and the Fischer home story was actually all too frequent, and one that we should really appreciate in terms of how much this costs us or threatens us in terms of our freedom. Mr. Fischer is using his own story to warn citizens and business leaders of the enormous toll of reckless prosecution. Our state, our region, and the country should be very thankful for him in sharing this. He has every right to return to relative anonymity after his experiences. And, you know, that is what I think brought the Buckeye Institute to this story. It's my hope that this afternoon we'll be able to promote this essential activity of vigilance by the people over their government. Our plan today is for us to hear briefly from the report author, John Entine, and then from Mr. Fischer and David Fischer, an attorney and advisor to Fischer Homes. And then we'll turn it over to our panelists for them to offer their observations of our book's findings in the Fischer Homes case. So if I could, our friend John Entine is the author of the book. John is an award-winning investigative journalist who is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. John is a former producer and executive at NBC News and ABC News. And I'd like to ask John to come up and give us the background on how his story, which began originally as an immigration law story, eventually became one on prosecutorial abuse. John, if you could.
The importance of that, the importance to our system, and I recall a quote from Mark Twain: "The secret to success in life is honesty and fair dealing. If you can fake that, you've got it made." And when I think of the U.S. Justice Department in this case, it reminds me of that quote, because I think that there was a lot of double dealing going on in this, and I think the consequences of that fell very hard on Mr. Fischer's shoulders. 3 years ago, I remember just being a person in the crowd, turning on my TV one morning and seeing dozens of black SUVs swarming onto a parking lot of a home builder in northern Kentucky, Fischer Homes. There were satellite trucks ready to beam the story over live TV, very well coordinated between the government and the camera crews. Agents wearing jackets that had big block letters, FBI, ICE, IRS, swarmed into the headquarters. It was like a high noon, a technological high noon. The government had engineered an undercover sting operation a number of months before, and according to the government, they had caught Fischer Homes, a prominent home builder here, as you know, with operations in Cincinnati and in Columbus. They had caught them employing illegal aliens. And so shortly thereafter, I was contacted by a public relations agency here in Cincinnati that was doing work with Fischer Homes, and asked to come to a meeting with Fischer's founder and president, Henry Fischer, and some of his key staffers, including his lawyers. At that very moment, as I found out, the government was threatening to shut the company down if it didn't immediately plead guilty to the alleged felony of knowingly harboring illegal aliens. The government was maintaining that the company had what they called a wink and nod agreement with subcontractors to employ illegal Mexican workers to help the company. It was part of a scheme, they said, to pay below market wages. By implication, alleged the government, Fischer Homes was financially benefiting on the backs of low-paid Mexican workers, and themselves were theoretically stealing jobs from Americans. "I asked you here," Henry said, "because I want someone with a reputation for independence to document what is happening. We don't even know all the facts yet. I think I need someone with a fresh eye who can look at what's happening and try to make sense of it. Am I being given total independence?" I asked. "Yes," Henry said. "That was important to me. I'm a journalist. I don't usually work with corporations, though for the past few years I've developed a consulting practice, but it's really, to some degree, to bring a kind of integrity watch on corporations that sometimes they don't have the ability to focus on those issues themselves." And that began for me an amazing 3-year project. For over the next 3 years, I was given complete access to the company files, its legal records. I interviewed dozens of Fischer associates, lawyers. No one was around to watch what I was doing. I had ability to contact anyone. I contacted people from the prosecution's case and really have the opportunity to piece together what I thought was the real story going on in the Fischer Homes case, not the one that you saw on TV, not the one that you read in the Inquirer and other papers. In the course of my research, my skepticism about was Fischer Homes guilty? Did they do something wrong? A natural inclination when the government comes down on your head. But my sympathy, my skepticism turned to sympathy and ultimately to anger. I began to believe that the government had unfair